You're looking at the West Block in Ottawa, where the House of Commons reopens and Parliament resumes despite the COVID-19 shutdown after Canada's four main parties failed to strike a deal on the number of in-person sittings that should be held under the circumstances. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Farah. Whether you're watching on TV or online, we're going to have more on Parliament resuming shortly as we await the latest update from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He's expected to speak in about 15 minutes. Now, we are hearing that the Prime Minister is going to begin with addressing the tragedy in Nova Scotia, where you might know by now, a tight-knit community is reeling following the deadliest mass shooting in Canadian history. A devastating killing spree that's left at least 16 people, as well as the shooter, dead. The rampage began on Saturday night. It continued well into Sunday morning, and it stretched across the northern part of the province. RCMP have identified this man, the suspected gunman, as 51-year-old Gabriel Wortman. At one point, investigators say he impersonated a police officer and was even driving what looked like an RCMP cruiser. He was eventually killed in a confrontation with police, and when the attack was over, at least 16 others were dead, including a 23-year veteran of the RCMP.
Heidi answered the call of duty and lost her life while protecting those she served. 2 children have lost their mother, and a husband has lost his wife. Parents have lost their daughter, and countless others lost an incredible friend and colleague.
The big question is still over motive. We still don't know. We may never know. But investigators say it appears the suspect did not know several of the victims. Unimaginable grief grips Nova Scotia right now, and much of our country amid already uncertain times. Global's Sara Richey joins us now from our Halifax studio. Sara, what is the latest? What do we know from last night?
Yeah, Farah, people in Nova Scotia just waking up to a sense of grief and shock and disbelief over what happened over this weekend. Just a horrific turn of events over a more than 13-hour period beginning on Saturday night, as you mentioned. We are awaiting right now the latest update from Nova Scotia RCMP. That's coming at 2 o'clock Atlantic time. That's the next time that we will hear from RCMP on what is no doubt a complicated and difficult investigation for them. As you know, Constable Heidi Stevenson is among those who were killed. We can tell you this morning that there are 3 other names we can share with you. Lisa McCulley was killed in this event. She was a teacher of grade 3 and 4 students at Debert Elementary. That's not far from where this all began in Portapique, Nova Scotia. Kristen Beaton was a continuing care assistant with the Victorian Order of Nurses. Her employer says she was a wife and a mother. Her colleague, Heather O'Brien, a licensed practical nurse, also with the Victorian Order of Nurses, was also killed. She was a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. There are numerous other victims. Absolutely, we know there are at least 16 as of right now, but our CMP told us yesterday that they were still searching for some of these crime scenes. Now, try to imagine the amount of chaos that goes into trying to sort out what's happened over a 12-hour period that stretches nearly a 100-kilometer span of rural Nova Scotia. There were crime scenes dotted between Enfield and Portapique. So you can imagine, with fires involved, police vehicles involved, and we found in our travels yesterday, some of our reporters came across scenes in places just pulled off the side of the highway. So trying to come to grips with what's happened here and trying to understand what happened here is going to take a lot of time, but we do know today countless families in Nova Scotia are in mourning.
Certainly, and we should be clear to our viewers. I know there are names that are floating around on social media, but we are being very careful with the names that we share. Of course, it's way more important that the family is notified first and that they don't learn about their loved ones over the media, over the news media. Let me ask you, though, how is the community dealing with this grief? Because these are tight-knit communities. I heard one MLA say yesterday that these are places where people leave the door open. They trust each other. They know each other. Talk to me more about that part of it.
Yeah, so where this all began on Saturday night is a little community by the name of Portapique that's on the shores of the Bay of Fundy. It's about an hour and a half outside of Halifax. There are 100 permanent residents in this place. About 250 people are here during the busier season when cottagers and tourists start to emerge for the summer. So you can imagine with only 100 people in the community, everybody knows everybody. And the people that we were talking to said, you know, when this started, they saw fires erupt on Saturday evening. And we spoke with a couple who said, you know, that seemed strange to them, a quiet Saturday evening. They went down the road to try to see what was happening, saw several more fires, heard gunshots. You can imagine, again, the chaos of that situation. They say they were stopped by police abruptly, told to go home, lock their doors, and not to come out. So that was the message for many hours from our CMP, starting at about 11 o'clock on Saturday evening. You know, the all clear not given until almost 13 hours later, about 11:40 local time the next morning. You're looking at pictures now of this gas station in Enfield where the suspected gunman was shot dead by police. That's when police were able to say that the situation was at least in control. But as I mentioned before, they still didn't have a sense of the scope of this thing. Even now, I'm not sure that we know the final tally in the death count, which is horrific news and something that a lot of people here are going to struggle with in the coming weeks and months. RCMP are just beginning this investigation on a scale, of course, that they just have never seen in this province.
Sarah, of course, this is all happening while people were self-isolating. We're going through a global pandemic. How do these two stories relate? Because the community, of course, can't grieve together as it would.
Yeah, and that's, you know, just absolutely devastating, Farah. When you think about it, the Maritimes has seen its fair share, more than its fair share, of regimental funerals in the last few years. You think back to the shootings in Moncton and in Fredericton, where the community came together in such a massive way to support the RCMP and the Fredericton Police Force after some of their officers were gunned down in the line of duty. With Constable Stevenson's death, I don't know how this will look. We're not sure exactly what will happen, but obviously that mass gathering of a regimental funeral can't happen. But on a smaller scale and just as important, for the people who've lost loved ones right now, there are travel restrictions in place in Nova Scotia. If you come here from outside of the province right now, you must go into self-isolation for 14 days. You're not allowed to gather with more than 5 people who aren't in your immediate household, and so you can imagine.
We're having a little bit of technical difficulty with Sarah's microphone, but of course we will continue to cover the situation in Nova Scotia. Meantime, I just want to show you a live shot outside Rideau Cottage. We're expecting the Prime Minister to address the tragedy there, as well as an update on the country's fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. And while we wait for the Prime Minister, let's take a look at the latest COVID numbers, COVID infections in Canada and around the world. We're going to begin with the big picture. Globally, there are now more than 2.4 million confirmed cases of coronavirus, with 765,000 of those in the United States and in Canada now. More than 35,000 people have tested positive for the virus. Now, taking a closer look at the number of cases across our country, Quebec still has the most infections with more than 18,000 cases. Ontario has more than 11,000 cases, with 606 new cases reported just moments ago, in fact. And across the country, more than 1,600 people have lost their lives. This is a look at the West Bloc. Again, we know the House of Commons is going to resume despite the COVID-19 shutdown. We stay in Ottawa. We're going to bring in our Mike Lecouture, who joins us from the Ottawa Bureau. Mike, do we know what this is going to look like? There's been so much debate. We knew the House of Commons was resuming, but do we know exactly how this is going to look?
Yeah, this was the date that they had fixed back on March 13th when they suspended the House of Commons, saying, look, April 20th might be the day that we can get back to normal. Obviously, things are not back to normal, but the House is reconvening. And that is thanks in large part to the lack of agreement between all parties. It sounds like the Liberals, NDP, Bloc Québécois, and at least the Greens have come to some sort of a consensus. And at this point, the Conservatives are not agreeing with them. And what that consensus is 1 in-person sitting per day and then 2 other virtual sittings per week. week, I should say. And the Conservatives say, why not have them all in person, and that accountability is best done face-to-face in the House of Commons. When you say what will it look like, it'll be like the other ones that we've seen. We've already had 2 of these emergency sessions in the last month or so, where you've had about 30 MPs, and of course representative of how many MPs they have in the House of Commons. So you'll have more Liberals, a few less Conservatives, and then so on and so forth with the other parties. And so they're going to be doing that today, so about 30 MPs. But the issue of how we haven't gotten to an agreement yet is something that a lot of people are sort of scratching their heads at here in Ottawa, because all parties except for the Conservatives are on board. And the problem here is not necessarily about accountability, although that's what the Conservatives are saying. It's how do we continue to be physical distant and not ask a lot of people come to work when everybody else in the country is told to stay at home. I mean, Andrew Scheer said in his press conference earlier today, look, if an MP can go to a grocery store to shop for some things, then they can surely come into this House of Commons that's built for 338 MPs. The difference is that it's not just that MP, it's staff, it's security, it's a whole number of people, cleaners that would have to come into the House of Commons as well. And also let's think about MPs that possibly come from far away. If you want representation from all regions, you'd have to have these MPs come and take planes, go through airports. We know how difficult that can be for people at this time. So it sounds like for right now, what we're going to see, it should be starting at any minute now, actually at 11 o'clock inside the House of Commons, that they will reconvene seemingly normal orders, normal business, for lack of a better term, and there could be some negotiation throughout the day. I've been speaking with different sources from different parties today, and they say still no deal. But listen now to what Jagmeet Singh has to say. He was talking today in a press conference about what he thinks still is lacking in some of the measures that the government has put out, and that's why he thinks that having these in-person meetings once a week would be worth it, because he says there are still gaps in a lot of the emergency benefits that still need to be filled. Have a listen.
Those who have lost work or lost their jobs or stopped working as a result of COVID-19, to those who have lost the opportunity to work in the future. And that would apply to students who are looking forward to working this summer and now have lost that opportunity. And so that change could only happen legislatively. So one session a week to make those changes to help people out.
And Mr. Singh thinks that, look, you can have the other sessions virtually, although that's not set up yet. The Speaker of the House of Commons said they're still working on it. But he says virtually, then you can have representation from across the country. You can have people from BC who will teleconference in or whatnot. But still, you have Andrew Scheer who says, look, the reason that we are wanting all of these extra sittings is because the opposition plays a key role. Have a listen now.
The Prime Minister continues to make this an issue of safety. If that was the case, the government should have been negotiating over the last few weeks to determine what the optimal number of members of Parliament in the chamber is and what public health requirements are needed to keep Parliament open. Instead, he keeps arguing that he should only have to show up in the House and answer questions to Canadians through their elected representatives one day a week.
And the argument that Scheer is making is that if the Prime Minister can have 7 press conferences a week where he is answering questions from journalists, then why can't he have at least 3 sessions in the House of Commons answering questions from opposition parties? Farah?
On that note, actually, I want to bring in David Aiken, who's our chief political correspondent at Global News. And I want to ask both of you, and starting with you, David, how much of this is political? I mean, we are all being told right now to stay at home, as was pointed out by Mike. How hasn't the government kind of gotten this together? Does democracy work in a virtual world? David?
Right. And just before I get to that, I just want to let you know I'm watching my feed of the
Okay, we're having a little bit of a problem with David. We're going to sort that out. Let's bring in Mike LeCouture on that note. And Mike, I mean, we all are figuring out ways to work from home, a lot of us. And why haven't why hasn't the government been able to do that? Or is it the opposition saying it doesn't work that way in a democracy?
Yeah, I mean, the opposition says, look, democracy can continue to work, and this is why it's important to have these accountability sessions. And what they want, and they continue to say, is that, look, any changes that came to the benefits came from suggestions from opposition parties and from these in-person sessions. It's interesting. During the press conference, one journalist had raised the specter of what is happening in Quebec, which is you have the leaders that get together twice a week for sort of these huddles and have that kind of session rather than bringing everybody back to the legislature. And keep in mind that in Quebec, yes, while it's a massive province, they would all still have to travel to Quebec City, but it's not as much of a travel as everybody coming to Ottawa from the outskirts of the rest of Canada, let's say from even Uconn. So there's that about it. But I mean, the question that really it comes down to is, is it do as I say and not as I do, or are these really that important? And I think what maybe Canadians are sitting at home right now and saying, look, I'm doing my part. I'm sitting here, and this is a crisis. I can't go out. Why are you going there to ask these questions? And I think it'll be telling as well. We should watch question period today. Which questions will be asked of this government? Will it be only on COVID-19 and their response, or will it be some other things?
Okay.
And there's the Prime Minister.
Thank you.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everyone. We are a country that stands united in our effort to defeat a pandemic, to save lives, and to help each other make it to a better day. But yesterday, we were jolted from that common cause by the senseless violence and tragedy in Nova Scotia. A gunman claimed the lives of at least 18 people. Among them, a woman in uniform, whose job it is to protect lives even if it endangers her own. Constable Heidi Stevenson of the RCMP. Constable Stevenson died protecting others. She was answering the call of duty, something she had done every day when she went to work for 23 years. This happened in small towns. Portapique, Truro, Milford, and Enfield are places where people have deep roots, places where people know their neighbors and look out for one another. There, everyone knows a Mountie because they're everything from police officers to social workers to teen counselors. Now these communities are in mourning, and Canada is in mourning with them. To the grandparent who lost a child, to the children who lost a parent, to the neighbor who lost a friend, we are so sorry for your loss. Such a tragedy should have never occurred. Violence of any kind has no place in Canada. We stand with you and we grieve with you, and you can count on our government's full support during this incredibly painful time.
Yesterday, at least 18 people died following a shooting in Nova Scotia, throwing families and their loved ones with the sense of loss. To grandparents who lost a child, to neighbors who lost friends, to parents who lost loved ones. Our thoughts and thoughts of all Canadians are with you. Such a tragedy should never have happened. Violence has no place in our country. We share your loss, and we are wholeheartedly with you through these very painful moments.
I also want to wish a full and speedy recovery to all those injured, including another RCMP officer. Canada is a vast and sweeping country filled with long stretches of lonely roads, with unwavering courage and compassion. Our Royal Canadian Mounted Police patrol these roads to keep us safe, as they have for over 100 years. I know that from coast to coast to coast, the women and men who wear the red serge in service to Canada are grieving deeply the loss of one of their own and one of our best. This tragedy is a painful reminder of the risks all of our first responders take to keep us safe. of the sacrifices they make every single day to protect our communities. Paramedics, doctors, nurses, firefighters, and police officers. They're always here for us. They've been stepping up through the pandemic, and yesterday in Nova Scotia, they showed that bravery. I want to take a moment to thank them all for their professionalism and their courage. Many of you are already working overtime because of this pandemic. Our communities need you now more than ever, and I know that can weigh on you at times. These are exceptional circumstances, yet you did what you always do. You ran towards danger. Without pause, without hesitation, you put your life on the line. On behalf of all Canadians, thank you for your service. I
will take a minute to thank all the first responders for their courage and professionalism. You already work very hard these days due to the pandemic. More than ever, we need you. And sometimes that responsibility is a heavy one to carry. In spite of exceptional circumstances, you did what you always do. You did not hesitate to risk your life to save others. So from all Canadians, thank you for your service.
This day is made all the more difficult because of the precious lives lost and the senseless act of one person. Just how could this happen? We may never know why. But we do know this. No one man's action can build a wall between us and a better day, no matter how evil, how thoughtless, or how destructive. Canadians are kind and generous. We are there for each other and we look out for one another. As families grieve the loss of a loved one, all Canadians are standing with them. The pandemic will prevent us from mourning together in person, but a vigil will be held virtually to celebrate the lives of the victims at 7 p.m. on Friday through the Facebook group Colchester Supporting Our Community. As we learn more about what happened yesterday, it's important that we come together to support communities. In the hours since the tragedy, I've spoken with Premier McNeil, RCMP Commissioner Lucky, Minister Blair, and many Nova Scotians, including our Nova Scotia caucus. We will continue to work together to see this through. I know that people have a lot of questions. This is an ongoing investigation, but I can assure you that the RCMP and local authorities will keep you updated. I want to ask the media to avoid mentioning the name and showing the picture of the person involved. Do not give him the gift of infamy. Let us instead focus all our intention and attention on the lives we lost and the families and friends who grieve.
Even if the pandemic prevents us from mourning together in person, a virtual vigil will happen at 7 p.m. on the Facebook page Colchester Supporting Our Community. It will be a chance for us to celebrate the victims' lives and to be there for their families and loved ones. I hope that many of you will join us. Whereas we're still trying to understand what happened yesterday, we have to be there for one another. Since that tragedy, I have spoken with Premier McNeil, the RC MP Commissioner Brenda Lackey, and Bill Blair from Public Safety, as well as our Nova Scotian caucus, amongst others. We will continue working together on that file. I know that people have questions. The investigation is still ongoing, but I can assure you that the RCMP and the local authorities will keep you informed of the latest developments.
I would also ask the media to not use the names or the photos of the perpetrator of this terrible act. Please don't do that for him. We should really focus on the victims and their loved ones as well.
I want to close today by addressing all the kids in Nova Scotia and right across the country. I know the world can seem like a mean and ugly place right now, but there's a whole lot of good in the world too. You'll see it in your neighbours and in Canadians in the days and weeks and months ahead. This is a difficult time, and it can be a scary time too. But we're here for you, and we're going to get through this together. I promise.
Merci. On va commencer la conférence de presse avec le téléphone aujourd'hui. Modérateur, c'est à vous.
Thank you. Merci. First question, Laura Osmond, the Canadian Press. Line open.
Mr. Prime Minister, wanted to ask you, Conservative leader Andrew Scheer today accused you of being inflexible in your negotiations about the number of in-person sittings in Parliament. I was wondering if there's any room for a compromise, 2 sittings per week, for example, given that moving forward may be preferable to no deal at all.
Look, I don't want to get into arguments with anyone today. We are working together amongst all parties to try and figure out a way to both protect and uphold our democracy, to ensure that there is proper accountability, while at the same time doing that responsibly. And I am hopeful that we're going to be able to come to an appropriate arrangement.
Follow-up question.
I was wondering if we could have an accounting of all of the ways that the opposition has been kept informed of the ongoing crisis and the government's actions outside of the House to date.
As I said, we have been engaged with all parties over the course of this pandemic. There have been many good ideas brought forward by business leaders, by community groups, by individual Canadians, but also by MPs from all parties who've heard from citizens in their communities what's needed to be done to help. This has been an unprecedented effort across government to try and make sure that we are giving Canadians the help they need to get through this difficult time, and we will continue to do that.
Merci. Prochaine question. Opérateur.
Next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Kate Bolangaro, Bloomberg. Line open.
Hello, Mr. Prime Minister. I have a question for you regarding navigating Canada through this crisis. Obviously, you're leading this G7 country through this pandemic, and you've also been personally impacted by this. So I'm wondering, how would you say that this pandemic has impacted your governing style as a leader and your perception of your role as our Prime Minister?
I think one of the things that we've seen right across the country is how Canadians have pulled together through this difficult time, and that's something that we've always done. We make sure we're there for each other when we encounter difficulties. And right across the country, whether it's premiers, whether it's municipal leaders, whether it's community groups or individual Canadians, we've seen Canadians step up for each other. And the privilege of being able to serve Canadians through this difficult time is really quite something when you see just how Canadians are resolute in their desire to support each other through this. Obviously, the capacity to work across all orders of government, work together as a country, is what is keeping us on a good path through this. There are too many tragedies to name going on as people lose loved ones right across the country. But at the same time, we know that what we are doing is helping prevent further tragedies, and we're going to continue to do that.
On a follow-up, Kate?
And how would you describe your strategy? What has it been in terms of inside the PMO office to getting us through these tough times? And how would you assess your own performance on that?
Our focus every step of the way has been listening to the best advice of experts and scientists on what we need to do to keep Canadians safe in this, and to ensure that everything we're doing is giving Canadians the comfort and confidence that we're all in this together and that we are going to be there for each other. I think that has been key to making sure that people are able to self-isolate, are able to take the difficult measures necessary to get us through this pandemic is to know that as a country, as systems, as governments, we're there for each other, and making sure that Canadians feel that support and know that we're going to get through this together has been key in making us able to get through this together.
Merci. Opérateur, prochaine question.
Next question.
Prochaine question,
My next question, Marie Vastel from Le Devoir. You have the floor. Hello, Mr. Trudeau. Well, I understand that you don't really want to talk about Parliament perhaps too much today, but the fact is that it's sitting as we speak. So I want to talk to you about that, ask you a question about Parliament. Could you tell us about what ordinary Canadians think about what's happening in Ottawa from their homes? People are at home and have been for more than 2 months now. They're in isolation. They're seeing what's going on in Nova Scotia with the pandemic as well. And Parliament is not able to actually sit because parties are unable to come to an agreement. What do you think Canadians think of what's happening? Well, I think that Canadians understand that it's important, not despite of the crisis, but because of the crisis, that we continue to advocate for our institutions, that we continue to have Parliament sit, but we have to do that in a responsible fashion. I think Canadians understand that, and it's important to continue with the measures that we've taken to help people across the country. What we're doing is putting forward possible ways of working in a responsible, constructive fashion. Most of the opposition parties rather agree with that approach, and I think our discussions will continue today to actually set out a roadmap so that we're able to actually protect our democratic institutions, but in a responsible way as well. Well, all right. There are some parties, or one specific party, that's accused the Conservatives of taking Parliament hostage. I'd like to hear you tell us what you think about that description of the current situation. I'd also like to hear what you think about compromise, negotiation with the other parties, because there is one party that's demanding 3 in-person sittings a week, rather. And you don't seem to agree with that. You're saying that you wanted to make sure that social distancing can be maintained, and to do that, you think that there should only be one actual in-person sitting. Shouldn't you just agree with the Conservatives so that Parliament can sit? Well, I don't want to get into that squabbling. I don't think that's what Canadians really want or what they expect from us. But Canadians want to know that we're doing what we have to do to protect our institutions, to make sure that our democracy continues to exist and flourish in this difficult time, and to make sure that there is accountability and questions are asked and answers are given. I'm very confident that today we will come to an agreement on an approach which will both ensure the continuity of our parliamentary institutions during this tough time, but in a responsible fashion at the same time. Thank you very much. Last question on the line.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question.
Next question. Louis Samuel Perron from La Presse. Over to you. Hello, Prime Minister. Your government, will it be tabling legislation to actually ensure stricter gun control in the wake of what happened in Nova Scotia? Well, there are many questions about what happened. There's an investigation underway about what actually happened in Nova Scotia, and I don't want to speculate on that yet. But I would like to say that we made clear commitments on stricter gun control. And just before this pandemic, we were about to table legislation to ban assault rifles from Canada and Canada's streets. We'll be picking up where we left off as soon as we have the opportunity to do so in the House of Commons once we've got through COVID-19. A follow-up question. Well, in Quebec this morning, construction workers returned to work sites, residential construction sites. Does your government support that measure in Quebec, and are you advocating for it to be replicated elsewhere in the country? Well, I think it's important that the various jurisdictions make their own decisions in their own jurisdiction. It's up to each region, each province, territory to assess what can be done and when. We're trying to coordinate based on shared principles, but provinces will take action at different times. But I think it's essential that no matter what decisions are made, the health and safety of workers and Canadians in general must be protected to stop the spread of COVID-19. That has to be the priority in any loosening of the lockdown conditions.
Given what we know about the shooting in Nova Scotia, could that have prevented these crimes? And if not, would you consider even tighter gun control measures?
As we know, this is very much an ongoing investigation that's in its early stages in Nova Scotia right now, so I don't want to jump to conclusions or make characterizations about what happened until we get a full accounting from the authorities. But in regards to gun control, we took very serious commitments in the election campaign and have moved forward and are moving forward on them to ensure that we're strengthening gun control in this country. I can say that we were on the verge of introducing legislation to ban assault-style weapons across this country. It was interrupted when the pandemic caused Parliament to be suspended. But we have every intention of moving forward on that measure and potentially other measures when the Parliament returns.
Would you approve of relaxing some physical distancing measures to allow the people in Nova Scotia to bury their loved ones properly?
I think that's a reflection that communities, that the province, and that all of us are going to have. We understand how incredibly painful it is for families who've lost loved ones in Nova Scotia this past day, to imagine that they're not going to be able to see them off together as a community. But at the same time, there are thousands and thousands of Canadians across this country who've lost loved ones to COVID-19 over the past days, and others who've lost family members to cancer and to other causes, who haven't been able to gather, to mourn, to grieve, to attend funerals. This is something that we are dealing with right now that is heartbreak on top of other heartbreaks. And I know that everyone will be looking for ways to demonstrate their solidarity without putting further at risk communities, first responders, our health professionals, and our seniors. Okay.
Well, I recognize that there are people who have lost loved ones over the past few days in Nova Scotia. But there are also people who have lost members of their families, friends, parents over the past few weeks to COVID-19. And they too have not been able to hold funerals to say goodbye to their loved ones together. Now, this is a situation which is tough, which is made even worse in times of loss and mourning. We must continue to be there for each other in tragic times. But at the same time, we must make sure that we're not creating greater risk and greater danger for our loved ones, for our neighbours, and for first responders and healthcare professionals as well. We need to do everything in our power to keep people safe and healthy during this pandemic.
Ryan Mullen, Global News. Prime Minister, was the Nova Scotia shooter on the federal government's radar? Were any federal agencies watching him?
There are many questions that people are asking about what happened and how it happened, and that investigation is ongoing, and I can assure everyone that the RCMP will be sharing details as they can, as they choose in the coming days, and there will be many opportunities to talk more about these things once we have a clearer idea of the facts.
What did you think when you learned about the degree of planning and impersonation in this terrible crime? Does it concern you that someone could create such a good fake?
I think as we learn more about this, we'll have to ask ourselves many questions about how it happened and if and what we can do to keep communities safer in the future. But my first thoughts when I heard of this tragedy yesterday and saw the numbers climb in terms of victims, my first thought was for Nova Scotians who, for the most part, know each other so much. They are such a connected group that I know that the vast majority of Nova Scotians will have a direct link with one or more of the many victims. And the entire province and the entire country is grieving right now as we come to grips with something that is absolutely unimaginable.
Kevin Gallagher, CTV National News. Prime Minister, as we're talking about the national tragedy in Nova Scotia and Canadians living under strict public health guidelines across the country, how appropriate is it for this ongoing battle over procedural matters to bring back Parliament? Why can't your government reach a deal on this?
I'm very hopeful that over the course of the day, Canadians will see parliamentarians coming together to demonstrate that our democracy is strong, that our institutions need to function, including during difficult times, indeed because of the difficult time we're going through, but that we can do so in a responsible way. As I've said, there is agreement amongst most of the parties in the House of Commons, and I hope to see by the end of this day that we're all in a place where we can both have our parliamentary institutions functioning, but doing so in a responsible way, given the context we're in.
I hope that we'll end up at the end of today with a reasonable way of making sure that, yes, Parliament and the democracy is operating, not in spite of the pandemic, but because of the pandemic. But we shall see. We are in a situation where we have agreement from most parliamentarians. We hope we will find the best way to continue sitting in a responsible way given the circumstances.
As a follow-up, what responsibility does your government take for not having this deal in place?
I think it's all of our collective responsibility to do the best we can through this difficult situation. It is really important for me that we continue to uphold our democracy, our democratic principles, the principles of accountability, the ability to move forward with new legislation to help Canadians. That really matters. But it really matters that we do so responsibly. I'm pleased that we have agreement amongst most parties, and I'm hopeful that by the end of the day today we'll have a clear path forward that will both defend our institutions and appreciate the context that we're in right now.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau, Philippe Vincent Foisy de Radio-Canada. Je comprends qu'il y a des questions.
From Radio-Canada. I understand that there are some questions that will come up for many days more given this investigation in Nova Scotia. I won't ask you the question specifically about Nova Scotia, but for Canada in general. How come that in 2020 we still have such massacres?
Parce que c'est une situation tragique qui nous rappelle.
Well, I think this is a tragic situation that reminds us that, unfortunately, there's still gun violence in our country. We have taken measures to reinforce gun control, but we have to do more. We are committed to do more, and we will do more. We need to make sure that Canadians can live safely in their communities, in the streets, and that's what we'll continue working on together.
Est-ce que vous allez participer à ces cérémonies-là?
Will you take part to the ceremonies, and could you file your bill on gun control in the next few weeks? Parliament will be sitting. You could file this week even.
Oui, j'ai l'intention de participer dans ces.
Yes, I intend to participate in the virtual vigils as much as possible, and we will most certainly look into this question and listen to Canadians' will to see more gun control. We will see what the possibilities are to table a bill when the moment is appropriate.
I have every intention of participating in the vigils virtually that I know many Canadians will be wanting to express their solidarity with the families in Nova Scotia who are grieving. And I am very much open to moving forward with our gun control legislation. I think there is always going to be questions about when is the right moment to do that. We are in the middle of a different crisis right now, but with Parliament returning in some fashion over the coming weeks, I think we will look at opportunities to do just that.
Merci beaucoup. C'est ce qui m'a fait la conférence de presse aujourd'hui.
Merci tout le monde.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking outside Rideau Cottage. Just to update you before we go to Ottawa, the Prime Minister has said that the number of victims has gone up in terms of who has been killed in Nova Scotia. That number now sits at 18. He also has asked the media not to show the photo of the gunman, saying that do not give this person the gift of infamy. Let's go to Ottawa to Mike Lecouture about the other big part of this press conference. And of course, that is the negotiations about the Parliament sitting. Parliament is sitting at this very moment as the debate continues. And the Prime Minister said, I don't want to get into any arguments with anyone today. There is still no deal, Mike.
Yeah, no deal, and it sounds like they're going to sit through today. And it, from the press conference that Andrew Scheer gave earlier today, it sounds like everybody agrees we'll get through today and possibly hammer out a deal by the end of today, and see where they go from here. The Prime Minister, asked several times, do you take any responsibility in not being able to come to a deal? There you see the parade that normally starts Parliament, and he said, look, we need to try and get to this agreement, and he's confident that they will get to this kind of agreement. And he understands that, yes, democracy needs to continue. We must uphold these democratic institutions, but at the same time, understanding that maybe now isn't the time to have multiple sittings all the time in Parliament.
I want to bring in David Aiken now, our chief political correspondent, because I understand there is some news from the House of Commons. David.
That's right. And I know Mike was busy watching the Prime Minister talk, and of course, while the Prime Minister was speaking, lots was happening in the House of Commons. Let me catch you up to speed. The government introduced a motion in the House of Commons that would see the House of Commons sit virtually on Tuesday, sit virtually on Thursday, and sit in person on Wednesday. There is not going to be an all-party agreement on that, and that's fine. There is simply going to be a vote on that now in the House of Commons after question period today. And this vote is majority only. There's 15 Conservatives in the House, 15 Liberals, 3 Bloc Québécois, 3 New Democrats, and 1 Green. You do the math there, the BQ plus the NDP plus the Liberals plus the Greens means the Conservatives are going to lose this vote. It's going to come after QP today. And so we are going to be seeing a series of virtual sittings twice a week and 1 in-person sitting on Wednesdays. The motion that was introduced while the Prime Minister was speaking has a lot of other rule changes. I'm not going to go into all the arcana, but among them that's kind of pertinent today, the government is committing not to introduce any measure that is not related to COVID-19. And so you heard the Prime Minister get asked about gun control measures. He said we would have been doing something on gun control had COVID-19 hit. Well, there will be no gun control measures so long as the House is in this special sitting period. But no agreement's going to be reached on the way the House will proceed. Instead, it'll just be a straight vote, and the Conservatives are going to lose that vote.
David, can we talk a little bit about that and the political aspect of this? How much of this is political? Is Scheer trying to appeal to his base?
No, I don't think it's about appealing to his base. And I'll take the Conservatives on their word. They want to hold the government to account, and that's their job. And they figure they can best do that with in-person sittings. Conservatives represent, by and large, many more rural ridings in this country. Rural ridings where there is not very good internet service, bandwidth is poor, and Conservative MPs, and I must say some other MPs, were concerned about being able to participate in a virtual House of Commons proceeding when they don't live in Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal where there's terrific internet service. Liberals tend to represent those urban ridings. So the Conservatives, for them, it was a matter of equality in terms of representation. They want to be able to hold the government to account. Now, New Democrats and the Bloc also want to be able to hold the government to account, but they believe that it can be done through virtual settings. There is a procedure underway separately with the House of Commons committee to figure out what do we do about remote and northern MPs who cannot connect via, don't have the bandwidth to connect, and people are trying to figure that out right now. But it's a moot point in any event because, as I say, the Conservatives are going to lose a vote this afternoon, and it looks like the House is now going to sit once a week in person on Wednesdays, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays they're going to meet virtually.
Okay, we're going to bring in Mike again, Mike LeCouture. Mike, let's talk about what the Prime Minister spoke about specifically in regards to Nova Scotia, a community that right now can't even get together to grieve.
Yeah, and he was asked specifically whether or not he would consider relaxing those physical distancing rules to allow for proper funerals. And he said, well, look, this is a very difficult time, and he understands how people will want to get together. He noted that there are thousands upon thousands of Canadians who have had to say goodbye to their loved ones virtually or not at all because of COVID-19, or they possibly died of other things in the last month. And seeing that, kind of understanding that, look, at times like this, we cover these kinds of stories. We see these memorials sort of pop up. We see flowers being laid, and we see people coming together and hugging. That can't happen here. That can't happen now. And that is going to be difficult for this community. And the Prime Minister acknowledged that kind of feeling of coming together and having that kind of a mourning that normally accompanies these types of difficult situations and these types of incidents, unfortunately can't happen this time. And that's why he's saying, look, there are these virtual funerals, virtual wakes, so to speak, that he too will be participating in because he feels that it's important to do so, but acknowledging how much more difficult this will be for this community and this province and frankly this country, because it is tragedy upon tragedy here that we all are facing now and all trying to figure out how to deal with it, Farah.
He called it heartbreak on top of heartbreak. And he ended speaking to kids in Nova Scotia, but beyond. But I think he was really speaking to all of us when he talked about what is happening right now, dealing with a tragedy during a difficult time.
Yeah, and trying to help everybody understand that we need to get through this together and lean on each other while at the same time still staying apart. And I think these are some of the messages that he's tried to weave in a lot of his press conferences and remarks before his press conferences, understanding that there is this so-called echo pandemic that is waiting in the wings, this mental health pandemic that could be coming when you consider, how much we all have to stay, away from each other. I can say to you personally that this weekend and the last 4 days have been tough for me because I've been going to stores, I've been, trying to limit my contact with people and not really sort of not being able to in some ways, and trying to get through this. And it is difficult. And I can't imagine how it is for people on the front lines who are working in these places. And so the Prime Minister trying to, again, underscore to people, look, we're going to get through this. Hasn't been asked recently what the timeline is and when we're going to be able to relax all of these. But we are hearing from different provinces, and we're going to hear from Ontario today on, what their new modeling looks like, and that things are actually looking better. So I think the Prime Minister and politicians are trying to also make sure that in any one of their messages, they include some level of positivity and something to look forward to, because I think a lot of Canadians at this moment are saying, how much longer will this have to go? Because it is weighing heavily on everyone.
I'm glad you mentioned Ontario. I'm going to bring back in David Aiken, if that's possible, because I want to understand at what point the Prime Minister needs to start talking about the economy. We saw people in the States this weekend who felt like they were disenfranchised, that were saying that they want things to get back to normal, some of them not believing some of the science out there. But on a lesser degree here, David, at what point is the Prime Minister going to have to talk about relaxing these rules? And at what point are people going to start getting fed up that their small business is kind of dwindling and life is really going to change forever?
A couple of things about that. First of all, to the extent that the federal relief programs, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and the wage subsidy program for business and emergency loans for business, if they work, might take a little bit of the pressure off to lift restrictions. But in any event, the Prime Minister's already indicated that he is definitely going to talk to the premiers. He wants to have the premiers involved in this, taking the advice of public health authorities. It's a little different than what we're seeing perhaps in the United States, where the president is sort of throwing it open to local authorities. The Prime Minister and the provinces seem to be very much on the same page about how this ought to happen, and different provinces are at different stages. Right now, Alberta is able to test people who simply have symptoms, whereas in Ontario, testing's only reserved for people who have symptoms and have run into somebody with COVID-19. So testing's a real important part of lifting some restrictions, but it's definitely going to be part and parcel. It's going to be with the provinces. And we should note that last week, I know Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, was asked about this, and he's been very hardcore. It is now not the time to be lifting any such restrictions in Ontario. Alberta is talking at this point, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, some very tentative steps on a very slow lifting in certain strategic areas. That also, to come back to Parliament, that's one of the things that the opposition parties believe is an appropriate role, the accountability role for opposition, is to ask the government, what are your plans? Do you have a plan? Will you involve the opposition in planning to bring the economy back and lift these restrictions?
You talked about province to province and how different it is, even within Ontario and Quebec now, how different it is. Michael Couture, what are we expecting to hear from Ontario today, I think in just a few minutes?
Yeah, expecting that the modeling numbers are going to look a lot better than they had originally forecasted about a week or so ago. And, you know, to David's point, I mean, don't forget that every Thursday there's a conference call between the Prime Minister and the Premiers, and they've all been this sort of Team Canada approach, and every one of them have come out of that for the most part anyways, saying that the same things. And so, you know, despite what we're about to see from Ontario, we could continue to see from Doug Ford to say, look, we're going to continue to follow public health advice. And the public health advice is, even though we are passing the possible peak, we need to maintain this. Don't forget, you had the WHO saying just a week ago, the way down the mountain is just as difficult as the way up the mountain. In other words, you can't just let everything go and expect the cascade of lower cases to continue. They need to make sure that they continue all of these measures, or else they will be for naught. I think the Prime Minister has continually said that, premiers have continually said that, and that may be, again, what I come back to is that glimmer of hope. Doug Ford in the province of Ontario could be coming out today and saying, look, things are looking good, folks, so guess what? Everything that you've done for the last few weeks has worked. So if you continue to do it, it's going to continue to work. And the message has been from the Prime Minister, from the get-go, and from a lot of the premiers, the longer that you ignore this, the longer you have to do it. So, ergo, if you continue to stay inside and continue to heed the advice of health officials, we're going to get through this quicker. And today might be that glimmer of hope that Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, feels he needs to give people of the province to say, look, I told you, and now it's working. So just please keep doing it.
There's certainly reason for optimism. The other thing is we don't know if we've passed the peak until we're on the other side of it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what Dr. Theresa Tam, the Chief Medical Officer of Canada, has said. And we may hear from her at their briefing as well, saying maybe we have passed it, maybe we haven't. But at the same time, people have to understand that it's not just when you pass the peak that everything goes back to normal, that it's a slow and gradual restart. You know, you have Quebec that is still floating the idea of when are we going to get schools back open? When are we going to get the economy back open? Hearing that, some garden centers were reopened in Quebec over the last few days, and trying to slowly restart things in the province and make people feel like things are getting back to normal, getting the economy back on track. But it will be slow, everybody. I mean, I don't like it as much as you, Farah, or anybody else feels like saying, sorry, we need to keep doing this. But I think politicians keep saying it. We keep trying to send that message out to people that, look, we need to continue to do this. It will continue to be weeks that this needs to happen. And the more that we all do it, the quicker we all get through this.
Okay, Michael Couture, thank you for that. David Akin, I have about 10 seconds left. Anything else from the House of Commons?
Just one thing about the shooting. Public Safety Minister Bill Blair will be speaking about this at 1:30. Of course, the former Toronto police chief, he, of course, would have some very important things to say about the RCMP investigation. 1:30 Eastern, he'll be speaking from Ottawa.
Okay. David Akin, thank you. And Michael Couture, also from Ottawa. Appreciate your coverage. And just to recap for you at home, we've learned the House of Commons is going to vote on the number of in-person sittings versus virtual sittings. The government is proposing 1 in-person, 2 virtual, and we are expecting the majority of MPs to vote in their favor. The Prime Minister also has now confirmed that at least 18 innocent lives were lost in Nova Scotia in this tragedy over the weekend. He paid tribute to them and their loved ones, and the first responders who risked their lives, as well as Constable Heidi Stevenson, who lost her life. Trudeau is also asking the media not to name and not to show the photo of the shooter, saying, do not give this person the gift of infamy. He also said, had it not been for the pandemic, the government would have introduced legislation banning assault rifles. And when the Prime Minister was asked about the state of negotiations, about the Parliament sitting, he said he doesn't want to get into arguments with anyone today. Of course, the discussions will continue. You can find full details on globalnews.ca and tonight on Global National. I'm Farah Nasser. Thank you so much for watching. We now return you to your regularly scheduled programming and a live look at the House of Commons.
Confirmed cases, including 1,611 deaths. We've been testing around 20,000 persons per day in the last few days, and for a total of over 555,000 people tested to date. Today I am going to speak more about people, thoughts and feelings than numbers and statistics, because each of us, alone and collectively, are what will determine when and how we emerge from this crisis. When it comes to stopping the COVID-19 pandemic, we are all on the front lines, and we all need to do our part. Nothing less than the continued sacrifice of every Canadian staying at home as much as possible and practicing physical distancing is what it will take to stop the spread of this virus. This is still urgently needed to save the lives of our most vulnerable members of society now and to buy more time for researchers to develop diagnostics, vaccines and treatments that will protect our health system and the health of all Canadians. We're at the start of a new week, though I recognize that these days it is hard to see the demarcation of one day from another, or of weekdays from weekends. I think everyone at home, as well as our essential workers, feel the strangeness, as our daily and weekly routines have become singularly focused on tackling this challenge. But whether you are at home, at your desk, and no shame if you're still wearing pajamas right now, or out on the front lines, taking a moment to pause and reflect can help. My reflection this weekend was on the incredible power of positive voices and of kindness, creativity, and innovation. At times like these, there can be a lot of negativity born out of anxiety, fear, and concern. But if we just turn our attention ever so slightly, we can become aware of the much greater power of even a single positive voice or a single act of kindness. It takes many negative voices to try to push us down, but even one positive voice can have the power to raise us all up. When we think about some of the darkest times in history, what we recall is the inspiring voices that guided and helped us along. If you are feeling down, turn to those voices, or if you can be that voice, speak up and raise people up with you. This weekend, I reflected on how thankful I am for the positive attitudes and many kindnesses shown by Canadians during this crisis. When times get tough and people band together, it is truly inspiring what can happen. These weeks have been hard, and there have been losses, with the most devastating being the loss of our loved ones to this disease. There is a shared sense of this pain, and people are responding with kind voices and music to raise spirits and bring us all together apart. From balconies in Italy, to a virtual student choir in Newfoundland and Labrador singing O Canada, to a world of entertainers and frontline workers coming together in solidarity this past weekend for the One World at Home concert, we are not alone. For everyone who is feeling down, anxious and worried about our future, turn your ears to positive sounds, look for kindness. Humble voices may not be loud, but they are strong, steady, and ready to come together when called. Thank you.
Bonjour. Avant de commencer, j'aimerais offrir mes condoléances à la famille et aux amis des victimes des événements terribles qui se sont déroulés au cours de la fin de semaine en Nouvelle-Écosse. Voici les plus récents chiffres concernant la COVID-19 au Canada. On compte maintenant 36 216 cas confirmés, dont 1 611 décès. Pendant les derniers jours, en moyenne, environ 20 000 personnes sont soumises à un test de dépistage chaque jour à l'échelle du Canada, ce qui porte à plus de 555 000 le nombre de personnes testées jusqu'à maintenant. Aujourd'hui, nous allons nous attarder davantage aux gens, aux réflexions et aux sentiments plutôt qu'aux chiffres et aux statistiques, parce que c'est chacun d'entre nous, individuellement et collectivement, qui déterminera quand et comment nous nous sortirons de cette crise. Dans nos efforts pour contrer la pandémie de COVID-19, nous sommes tous aux premières lignes et nous devons tous contribuer. Ce sont les sacrifices que chaque Canadien continue de faire en demeurant à la maison autant que possible et en pratiquant l'éloignement physique qui nous permettront de mettre fin à la propagation de ce virus, rien de moins. Ces mesures sont toujours aussi essentielles pour sauver maintenant la vie des personnes les plus vulnérables de notre société et donner plus de temps aux chercheurs afin qu'ils puissent mettre au point des diagnostics, des vaccins et des traitements qui protégeront notre système de santé ainsi que la santé de tous les Canadiens. Nous entamons une nouvelle semaine. Bien que nous soyons conscients qu'il est difficile ces jours-ci de distinguer une journée d'une autre ou même une journée de semaine d'un jour de week-end. Nous sommes convaincus que tous ceux à la maison, tout comme nos travailleurs essentiels, ont cette étrange impression, étant donné que nos routines quotidiennes et hebdomadaires ne vise maintenant que le seul but, c'est-à-dire surmonter ce défi. Mais que vous soyez à votre bureau à la maison, sans gêne d'être en pyjama, ou en première ligne, c'est une bonne chose de prendre un moment de répit et de réflexion. Ce week-end, nous avons réfléchi au pouvoir extraordinaire que représente le positivisme, la gentillesse, la créativité et l'innovation. La situation que nous vivons actuellement peut engendrer beaucoup de négativité en raison de l'anxiété, de la peur et de l'inquiétude qui nous assaillent. Mais si nous changeons le moindrement notre optique, nous réalisons toute l'importance qui revêt une seule voix positive ou une seule acte de gentillesse. Il faut de nombreuses voix négatives pour tenter de nous faire tomber, mais il suffit d'une seule voix positive pour nous donner la force de nous relever. Lorsque nous pensons aux périodes les plus sombres de notre histoire, nous nous souvenons d'abord les voix inspirantes qui nous ont guidés et aidés à nous en sortir. Si vous avez le moral dans les talons, concentrez-vous sur ces voix positives. Si vous pouvez être cette voix, prenez la parole et encouragez les gens à suivre votre exemple. Ce week-end, nous avons réalisé à quel point nous sommes fiers des attitudes positives et de nombreuses manifestations de gentillesse des Canadiens durant cette crise. Lorsque les gens unissent leurs efforts durant une période difficile, ce qui peut en découler est fort inspirant. Les dernières semaines ont été difficiles et les pertes ont été nombreuses. La plus grande perte était celle de notre chair des suites de la maladie. Nous ressentons toute cette douleur qui nous pousse à faire preuve de bonté et à puiser dans le pouvoir de la musique pour nous remonter le moral et nous rassembler. Que ce soit les Balkans en Italie, Une chorale virtuelle d'étudiants entonnant le Canada, Terre-Neuve et Labrador, ou un événement de solidarité réunissant des artistes et travailleurs de première ligne de partout dans le monde, comme le concert One World at Home le week-end dernier, nous ne sommes pas seuls. À tous ceux qui se sentent déprimés, anxieux et inquiets quant à notre avenir, prêtez l'oreille au son réjouissant et portez l'attention aux gestes de gentillesse. Les voix humbles ne font peut-être pas beaucoup de bruit, mais elles sont fortes, constantes et prêtes à se mettre à l'unisson lorsqu'il le faut. Merci.
Thank you, doctors. We will now open the line to questions. Vous pouvez poser vos questions dans l'une des deux langues officielles. We ask that you limit yourself to one question and only one follow-up. For those asking a question in the room, we ask that you make your way over to the freestanding mics. Operator, over to you for a question on the line.
Thank you. Thank you. Please press star 1 on your telephone keypad. If you have a question, s'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour toute question. La première question, the first question is from Laura Osman from the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. Your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Good morning, Dr. Tam. I know you said you didn't want to talk about numbers today, but I do have some questions about the data for you. There were some epidemiologists who were really encouraged and optimistic over the weekend, saying that some provinces may have passed their peak already, that others may be approaching their peak, that the data suggests the reproductive rate of the virus is way down. I'm wondering, when you take all the provincial data together, does the federal picture support that? And what does it tell us about the capacity of our healthcare system moving forward if this trend continues?
Yes, so overall, I think our health system is coping. So I think that is a very critical aspect to maintain in terms of a response. And in terms of, as I mentioned last week, we are seeing the slowing of the growth of this epidemic. We do have a very varied picture in terms of the epidemiology across the country. There are definitely areas of Canada that haven't really seen community transmission, and then, of course, in the bigger provinces where they have. But even those signs are moving towards the positive as well. So I think you've heard some of the updates from British Columbia, for example, but all chief medical officers are trying to be extremely cautious at this time. Even if the outbreaks are slowing down, now is absolutely not the time to sort of change our current stance. We need to keep going on our public health measures, but I think it's a testament to the work of all Canadians that we have managed to move to this more positive direction. I do have to say that there are some concerning areas that we're watching very closely, not just long-term care facilities, the people experiencing homelessness, but certain workplaces, of course, where they may be not necessarily in the workplace conditions. We heard of a work camp in Alberta and other settings where I think we need to take a significant amount of care so that we don't ignite new chains of transmission. So those reproduction numbers, for example, can change quite sensitively to the actions that we take.
And one follow-up, Laura?
Yeah, I was wondering about the hospitals that are putting their PPE aside in hopes they can sort of effectively disinfect and reuse them. Has there been any proven progress on that yet, or are we likely to see that PPE discarded eventually?
So I think the first areas of action is always to get more PPE, so pulling out all stops to get supplies. That still remains, but we need to look at all options. So sterilization of respirators, for example, and other PPE is currently being looked at as well. We are working across Canada to, yes, conserve some of these, but also we're now looking at the actual sterilization equipment and having them distributed across Canada. So it remains a aspect of our strategy for ensuring that healthcare workers have the personal protective equipment and that they're protected.
Thank you, operator. Next question on the line.
Thank you. The next question, la prochaine question is from Justin Ling from Freelance. Please go ahead. Your line is open.
Hi there. Dr. Tam, can you talk to me a bit about the situation in Canada's prisons? I know you've mentioned it before as an area of concern for you. You just sort of listed some areas where, poor conditions could lead to a whole new round of transmission. And I'm wondering what advice you're giving the government as to what they should do to avert the spread of COVID-19 inside federal institutions.
Yes, a very important part of our response, I think, not just in federal institutions, but in any of the correctional institutions across the country. But certainly we have been working very closely with Correctional Services Canada. There have been a number of outbreaks and in different federal correctional facilities. And what we've been trying to do is to support them in terms of infection prevention control advice, ensuring that they're well linked into the local public health system, that they have protocols in place to prevent the introduction and spread of the virus. As well as right now we have provided an epidemiologist to British Columbia to further understand what the transmission dynamics were in Mission, British Columbia, where there has been and is currently experiencing an outbreak. So we will be learning from those experiences to ensure practices in any other institution. So, and also ensuring that there are personal protective equipment, for example, for essential service workers, including staff, but also under circumstances where social distancing is difficult, to sort of maximize how that can be done under that setting as well. Hygienic measures and everything else, cohorting of people who are sick away from those who are not, and expanding testing in those settings as well. I think these are settings where lab testing needs to be prioritized. So all of that is happening right now.
And one follow-up?
With respect, some of those things aren't happening, though. I mean, when you talk about testing, there's only been, I think about 500 tests done, and most of that's only the last couple of days. PPE is not being widely used. Some nurses say they're not being given adequate amounts. Inmates are still being moved from institution to institution. A lot of the things you're encouraging just aren't being done, and I think that might be the cause of some of these outbreaks. And some healthcare professionals have been voicing concerns, saying that the only way to really enable social distancing is to start decarcerating people or reducing the number of people in individual institutions. Would you endorse that sentiment? And do you feel the government is actually listening to the recommendations you're giving?
Well, I think everybody is trying hard. Like the same with long-term care facilities. I think province and territories really trying hard to prevent the spread of infection, and we know that to be very important. The correctional services environment is another one of those settings. And so I think people are doing, we recognize that, and then people are looking at what the implementation of some of that advice, and which included everything that I just talked about. And from a public health agency's perspective, we will provide the technical advice and support that they need. Many other government departments are trying their utmost to, of course, acquire personal protective equipment. As I've said, the lab testing has increased in Canada, and that will continue to be an area that we are continuously to improve. But for sure, I think re-looking at the lab testing approaches in these special settings is very important. I'm sure we will be looking at how that is improved based on the experiences that we've just had.
Thank you, Dr. Tam. We'll now turn to the room for some questions. Julie?
Julie Van Dusen, CBC. Dr. Tam, right now in this building, MPs are debating how to approach Parliament in a pandemic, whether it should be virtual or in-person sittings. So they're having a debate about this. Do you have any recommendations about how they should approach this, keeping in mind there will be some in-person sittings?
I think our advice will be that similar to other workplaces where there's essential services right now, and obviously physical distancing is important. So however this is set up, the advice on physical distancing remains, as well as all the other measures, whether it's administrative, whether it controls making sure people don't go to work if they're sick, having hand hygiene measures observed, and whatever they do in terms of trying to maintain that physical distancing. Many workplaces, of course, have done teleworking, and others just to reduce the amount of sort of mixing and in order to maintain the physical distancing as well. So I think Parliament, like other essential workplaces, needs to have a plan to make sure all of these measures are implemented as they are having their meetings.
Okay. Considering the importance of testing, and some provinces are lagging, do you have any message about what they should be doing?
I think we're working really closely with every province, and it is their collective goal to increase testing in Canada. I do think that that has really increased even in the last several days. So at some point, a few weeks back, we were at about 12,000 tests a day. That gradually increased, and now in the last several days, we've been testing around 20,000. And provinces that were not testing as much before is now testing quite a number more. And so I think we'll see that dynamic increase. Interestingly, though, there are some areas where the symptomatic people have reduced, so that's a good thing, not just perhaps because of COVID-19 activity, but in general, respiratory illnesses have dropped. So in fact, some of the demand for testing has also come down. So I think the number of people being tested a day, we will want to continue to increase that. But that number is a mix of a number of different dynamics as well.
Thank you, Dr. Tam. Next question, Ian.
Ian Woods, CTV News. Dr. Tam, you began today's press conference talking about one national tragedy before moving on to our national crisis we're in, and talking about how we have to talk about feelings and our thoughts about it. So what's a message to someone or to the province of Nova Scotia, people who need to grieve what they just went through in a time where they're already suffering emotionally, or, what do you have to say to them? What can people do to grieve, and how should we do this safely?
I think it is an extremely, extremely difficult time that I think communities have to come together. I know that our public health colleagues are also, of course, providing support to those who have to mourn in the safest way possible. We do know that certain settings can increase the transmission of COVID-19. So I think certainly work with local public health to look at how we best express our sadness and our condolences and support each other in the safest way possible. And some of this might be different to how we've mourned together before, including the tremendous amount of stress as a result of not being able to be physically close to each other, but look for many ways in which you can reach across and share your feelings in a more virtual way. It is going to be tough, there is no doubt about it, but I think people will find a way, and I think people in Nova Scotia will, in their own way, be able to mourn together. And so, but I do recognize this is particularly stressful. We do have, I think, in numerous jurisdictions, trying to improve our mental health support. And make sure people know who to reach out for, some of the helplines. And I know we've just launched a sort of mental wellness platform. I think it makes a lot of difference if you can reach to anyone in a time of need very quickly. And so I think I would encourage everyone to take advantage as much as possible on those virtual means as well. Thank you.
And in the United States, we're seeing a lot of very sensational photos and videos of protests, people protesting social distancing. And even across this country, there have been very small pocket groups that have popped up. For Canadians who might be getting restless or antsy at home, obviously these protests are such fringe groups, but how do we promote people to reject that and to follow with the health proceedings that have been laid out for us?
Yes, I think for Canadians, you've done a great job so far. We know that what you have been doing in terms of physical distancing and all the other public health measures that you've observed have been working. We are approaching another very critical period, and as I said, even if we see the peak of the epidemic in your area, the disease can return very, very quickly. So as the public health system tries to lay out the plans for the next phase of what that new normal might look like, now is not the time to let go of all the hard-earned efforts that you have just put in to slow down this epidemic. We've got to keep going, but the key is even amongst the most stressful situations, we need to look at that positive voice, and there will be people in your area, your family, where that actually can happen. And I would say that if you have these images of people who are questioning social distancing and these measures, recognizing the population immunity is likely to be quite low at this time, you only have to then look at the images of what New York City has been like, the devastations of tens of thousands of people being severely impacted over a very short period of time, and that is not what we want. And so I think take this really seriously and keep up the momentum that we've gained, and do not let the positive efforts be squandered if we don't tread carefully onto the next stage. This virus will come back. So I'll encourage everybody to try and remain positive as you are helping all of us achieve epidemic control. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tam. Operator, over to you for two last questions on the line.
Thank you. The next question is from Marie Vastel from Le Devoir. Please go ahead. Your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Yes, hi, Dr. Tam. I was hoping to get your recommendation, I guess, on workers and masks. We see that some workers are going back to work at some provinces, for example, in the construction industry, and those people aren't necessarily wearing masks. I'm wondering how much of a risk is it, given that it's sometimes hard to guarantee that those workers don't necessarily touch the same tools or keep a 2-meter distance at all times. Do you have any concerns about that?
I think our public health advice is that a very systematic approach needs to be provided to workplaces to reduce spread and keep workers safe. So both looking at the actual administrative controls and work arrangements. Sometimes it might mean in certain settings screening people before they start work in terms of symptoms and making sure sick people don't go to work. Try as much as possible, maintain that social distancing, provide hand hygienic measures, do more environmental cleaning where possible. But recognizing that in some settings where maintaining physical distancing might be difficult, then the same as in the general population, then consider wearing facial coverings might be appropriate for that setting. So I think each of those settings need to evaluate that risk, and that is to protect others, actually. So in settings where you actually protect yourself against transmission from actually ill persons in certain settings, that's a different thing, that you actually need personal protective equipment. But I think if it is to protect each other in a workplace, then, and you can't maintain social distancing, then facial coverings are a consideration, that an option that people can use. But I think that nothing is as important as to at least try as much as possible to maintain that physical distancing and all the other measures.
And one follow-up?
Thank you. On another topic, I guess, I'm wondering how concerned you are about the situation in Quebec. The numbers we're seeing is that about half of the cases in Canada are in that province. Half the deaths as well are in that province. Are you concerned about those numbers? And how do you explain that the situation seems to be so much worse in one province as opposed to the others?
So there's probably many different factors, and certainly right now, the very challenging situation in Quebec includes the long-term care homes and seniors' homes. So I know that all of the health system and public health colleagues are working really hard, I think, to ensure that transmission and spread is reduced in those settings. That's absolutely paramount. So I think you're seeing some of that sort of challenge. And I think it is not just Quebec, but obviously that is sort of very key. And it speaks to, I think, a long-standing issue with managing the spread of infection in long-term care homes and senior residences. So I think that is what they are, working very hard to manage right now. Now, as I said, also as you approach the peak of a outbreak, you are going to also see, unfortunately, and especially because it's many seniors impacted, that the number of deaths reported each day and probably over this next week is expected, I think, to increase in that province. So that, I think, is the picture that we're looking at right now. So a massive focus on getting those settings appropriately protected and the outbreaks managed.
Et voici Dr. New. Peut-être je peux aussi ajouter quelque chose à ce que Dr. Tam a dit. Peut-être vous voulez faire peut-être une suivi avec les autorités sanitaires du Québec, mais ce qu'on comprend ici à l'échelle nationale, c'est aussi le Québec aussi change un peu leur chiffre, comment ils mettent ça au public, parce qu'au début, je pense que toutes les provinces font des rapports seulement sur les cas confirmés au laboratoire. Après, le Québec aussi changé parce qu'après, c'était seulement le laboratoire à l'échelle provinciale. Puis après, c'était aussi les rapports des cas confirmés avec un réseau de laboratoires à travers la province. Et maintenant, plus récemment, ils ont changé aussi, ils ont ajouté aussi des cas, comme on dit, seulement liés épidémiologiquement aux autres cas sans avoir une confirmation de laboratoire. Et aussi, c'est la même chose avec les décès.
And this is the same thing for deaths. That is part of the explanation as to why the numbers are higher in Quebec. Thank Merci, you. Dr. New. La prochaine question sur la ligne. Next question.
Thank you. Merci. The last question is from Lena Dib, La Presse canadienne. Please go ahead. Your line is open. Votre ligne est ouverte.
Oui, justement sur la question, Dr. New,
Dr. New, question in terms of what you've just said.
Est-ce que d'un point de vue national, quand vous regardez les chiffres des autres provinces en dehors du Québec, que ce soit le nombre de morts ou le nombre de cas, est-ce que votre compréhension à vous, c'est que
according to you, it's because it's underestimated outside of Quebec?
Je pense que si on parle vraiment à l'échelle nationale, je pense que c'est vraiment en effet une sous-estimée partout au Canada. C'est quelque chose qu'on prend pour acquis que toujours si on a les cas confirmés, le laboratoire, tout ça, c'est toujours une sous-estimée. C'est presque impossible de voir comme 100%, comme c'est une réflexion de la vraie réalité sur le terrain. Mais c'est toujours pour les provinces et territoires, aussi nous autres, on travaille étroitement avec nos homologues, d'avoir le plus possible presque le plus proche de la réalité. Donc, avec l'augmentation de la capacité de laboratoire, au fur et à mesure, on voit que les provinces ont fait plus des tests, des analyses, des dépistages des personnes touchées par le COVID-19. Et on voit aussi que le pourcentage des dépistages confirmés positifs a aussi augmenté. Je pense que ça donne nous autres c'est plus une réflexion de la réalité, mais c'est quelque chose, on continue, on fait nos meilleurs efforts à travers le pays pour toujours augmenter, pour mieux préciser aussi ce qui se passe actuellement.
Oui, alors on comprend que c'est sous-estimé partout. Est-ce que c'est underestimated everywhere? Is it less underestimated in Quebec compared to elsewhere in the country?
And my other question in terms of the wearing of masks in the construction industry that started up in Quebec, based on what you said a few days ago, saying that people who are pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic might be contagious. I don't really understand why you're not advising clearly that people should wear a mask if one is working in the construction industry, as many people are doing as of today. Answer.
Pour n'importe qui de dire, OK, une province a fait un meilleur job de
sous-estimer. To say that one province has done a better job than the other for underestimating or overestimating. But what's happening in Quebec and in terms of all the tests that they've done in Quebec, I think they've done an excellent job to test the high-risk population. So the numbers in Quebec are a pretty good reflection of what's happening on the ground. Concerning masks, as Dr. Tam and myself have stated several times, the most important thing is to have sufficient medical masks such that the PPE should be for healthcare workers and essential healthcare workers to protect them against contamination. If one is working in a hospital, one can meet or deal with somebody who's sick, who is sneezing and coughing. But as far as the general population is concerned, we understand that there might be a bit of evidence indicating that there are some people who might transmit the virus to others when they're pre-symptomatic. So the use or the option of using a non-medical mask for those people in the general population, that would be based on the concept that one is trying to protect others and not protecting oneself from others. So I think that it's important to underscore that all the public health measures, such as physical distancing, good hand washing practices, staying at home if you're sick, that's more important, but it's always an option for workers to wear a mask, a non-medical mask.
Merci, Dr. New. That concludes today's briefing. Thank you.
Thank you.